Hi. I won't even be able to scratch the surface really on a topic like this in 20 minutes, but hopefully there'll be lots of time for questions at the end. And I find this a good place to start. It's a lovely quote. "How wonderful that we've met with a paradox. Now we have some hope of making progress." It's a good attitude, and the paradox here is that we have a critical weight range, ground-dwelling, endangered mammal looking perfectly happy and at home in an environment that we nature conservationists would generally just treat as a write-off. And what's the progress to be made? Well, the bandicoot doesn't see it that way. Of course, it's blissfully unaware that it's supposed to be some delicate endangered species. It's just found a workable niche on those lawns, and like a kind of mammalian magpie, is exploiting it for as many cockchafer grubs and earthworms as it can get, and it's doing a very good job of it. Now, of course, my point is not that urbanisation is not as bad as we all thought, but I do hope that it opens up the possibilities of how it could be if we really tried to make it better. Here's my friend David Eads creeping up on a pipit that seems very aware of his presence. And he's on the Elwood foreshore. It's one of our favourite bird watching spots locally. You can see here it's deep in suburbia, and tiny little patches of indigenous vegetation there, in amongst a lot of lawns, paths, people, cars, etc. And it doesn't look like much to many people, but it is of great ecological significance. And one day Dave was down there in spring, and he came across a brown songlark. Spring is a time of a lot of bird movement, especially around September. And he texted me, and I got down there with the camera and took this photo of it. That's a bird that is looking for much more vast areas of habitat, but for this day anyway, it's got to make do with the lawns. They will sustain it until it can find better habitat. We kept looking around, and this popped up, which is a Horsfield's bushlark, which is slightly rarer than the brown songlark, and again, the plains to the west of Melbourne suit it, particularly the kangaroo grass remnants. But today it's in amongst Poa annua and cake daisies. And the day just got better and better. This sacred kingfisher turned up, and potentially has come from as far as Papua New Guinea or Indonesia. And it's not going to find permanent habitat here either, but may find a skink or two on the way through if it's very lucky. A few of those locally. Better and better. Rufous whistler. And it was becoming quite a special day. You can see here a rose robin. When that popped up, at that point it was just ridiculous, and I was too excited. And you can see the photo quality is declining seriously here with successive birds. But that's going to be on the lookout for other habitats altogether, mostly wet forest, particularly that with a mid-story of silver wattles. And then this turned up, and that was big news. It's a white-throated gerygony. And I should point out, this is all within about a 50-metre radius, all of these birds, and within a few hours. And I knew Dave had never seen one of these locally in his 30-odd years of birdwatching, probably 40 years. And I texted him. He was still off photographing the bushlark, and I rushed out of the scrub because I wanted to photograph the man in action mid-sprint, because I knew he was going to be keen. And there he is, heading towards the gerygony, which he did get to see, happily. And my point is that we treat environments like this as sort of separate from the broader living landscape. You know, we think of humans and nature as being separate, and these birds actually have no choice but to treat it as part of that landscape. And they show us that indeed it is, for better or worse. It's part of the natural world. So how we manage it has important flow-on effects, not only locally but further afield. And what do I mean by that broader living landscape? Well, like the out there, the wild. This was a place which I'd heard a lot about, Ainsbury Forest, and that crested shrike tit was the first I'd ever seen. I saw it when we went there, and Ainsbury Forest is supposed to be the last bastion of a lot of these dry woodland birds in our region, and still has populations of things like diamond firetails and crested bellbirds and all sorts of goodies. But when we went there, the thing that really struck me about it was not just the beautiful birds, but that is the largest patch of grey box woodland south of the Divide, and one of the largest in Victoria. It's really just a tiny speck in a sea of agricultural landscape and urban sprawl. And really, this is the pattern for reserves in general. They are isolated and in smaller patches than they used to occupy, of course. So what does that mean for the things that live there and make up those reserves? Well, it's not very good. Even just basic processes like population fluctuations over time, that's fine when you've got a large population. If an area like that were to be hit by a drought, the birds would reduce in number with less food, but then they would bounce back again. But in this case, where you've got a very small population to start with, they can easily just blink out of existence, and then you have local extinction. And not only that, but also genetic factors, so genetic drift and also just reduced genetic diversity, which can damage the fitness of the population and their ability to reproduce, and obviously that's very bad. So local extinctions are not something we think about a lot in conservation. We think of species extinctions, and so we should be concerned with those because they're occurring at about 1,000 times the natural background rate. But local extinctions, or extinctions of populations, as it's sometimes called, is occurring at millions of times the background rate, and that is really what is eroding ecological functioning around the globe. Because from a purely functional perspective, an ecosystem doesn't really care if a species still exists somewhere else in some other reserve. What's important is whether it's still living in its landscape and in sufficient numbers to really have that functional role that it should. And this concerns all of us. It could be the organisms that no longer survive on our patch of land, which is our garden or our farm or our neighbourhood. This is when we start thinking about the potential and the history of the place that we live on. Now, I went to Tasmania recently and I was on the lookout for a really special bird called the 40-spotted pardalote. It only lives in Tassie. And it took me here, that search, which was, I got to say, a bit of a surprise, because you think you're going to Tassie, you're going to be surrounded by a lot of wilderness, like on the ads. And of course there is a lot of native vegetation there, relatively speaking, but the 40 spots tell a slightly nuanced story about that, and that is they rely on manna gums on fertile lowland soils. That's their habitat, and that's also highly prized for agriculture, and then following agriculture it tends to become urban areas. So 40 spots they're now critically endangered, and they're generally found just in these tiny little strips and pockets where small areas of manna gums on fertile lowland soils still remain. And this area was actually, seen as synonymous with 40 spots. It was one of the most famous populations on mainland Tassie. And that is it from the ground, looking across it. So really hemmed in on all sides. And when I went there, I felt like I was chasing a ghost. I never came across one of the birds. And I then later read that the last survey done a couple of years before recovered only 10 individuals. So a pretty bleak outlook for a population in that state. But more broadly, that conflict for land that I mentioned, for the best land, if you like, the most productive land, plays out for many species over a very wide area. So you can see this southern boobook is pretty tolerant of many different habitats. It occurs, right through from the tropics to temperate areas and deserts and alpine and everything. but it avoids that little kidney-shaped area over in the west of the continent. And it shares that pattern with a lot of species, actually, because that's the Western Plateau. Extremely arid. There are no river systems there. Not one fish species has ever been recorded in that whole 2.7 million square kilometres of land. So it's pretty hostile. But of course, there are things that do live there. But certainly, it's not a biodiversity hotspot, if you like. And here's the pattern repeated even more. It's very, very clear. So if you were trying to create a reserve system that was representative of continental biodiversity, you would, of course, concentrate those reserves in the area where most of the biodiversity is. But actually, for the most part, you see the reverse of that. And that's, again, because of this conflict where we want the same land as wildlife, for the most part. We want the river flats and the fertile soils and the well-watered parts of the country. And the reserves go in the places which really can't be farmed or built over anyway. So that's where it leaves the boobook, trying to eke out an existence in a human-dominated landscape. And that means that if we want to preserve nature, we really have to find ways for biodiversity to thrive alongside us in human-dominated landscapes. That is what the world largely is now. I think more than 50% of non-ice covered land is now under agriculture, and of course cities are growing. So if we want wildlife to be a part of the future, which is really the same as do we want the ecosystems that sustain us in the future, then we have to find ways of fitting it in with that picture. And on the ground, what does that look like? Well, this is where most people live in Australia. It's a sort of suburban landscape. That's where I live. And to our eyes, may not really inspire a whole lot of imagination in terms of, wildlife habitat, but I think that's mostly a product of our human bias that we look through, because we see buildings and straight lines and glass and we think unnatural, and therefore we can't imagine that being wildlife habitat. But let's try looking at it through the eyes of wildlife, because they don't have those biases. They don't see the dichotomy between natural and unnatural. It really doesn't matter to them. What does matter is the habitat livable or not? Are there opportunities to exploit? Is it functional? And so, looking at it from that perspective, buildings might as well be boulders. And you can imagine a landscape much like this, which, by the way, I should point out, is still an extreme kind of a habitat, because it's dominated by impervious surfaces, just as cities are. And that is a major limiting factor on biodiversity, because that basically means that there's less resources being produced by the land. Everything's a bit more diffuse. And that's something that we have to try to tackle to improve wildlife prospects in cities. And the first thing you might think of in doing that is tinkering with those impervious surfaces to get plants growing on them again. But in actual fact, this is more of an art installation than a benefit to the environment, unfortunately, because it's based on petrochemical products and needs constant inputs of water, virtually, because it's got no soil. And so it's also quite expensive, and not the kind of thing you'd want to upscale for habitat purposes, because you'd be doing more damage than good. But that doesn't mean you have to throw the idea out altogether. You can play around with it and get around those problems. And this is a little test which I've got going in my backyard at the moment, looking at how common building material, cinder blocks, could be redesigned or even retrofitted to have plants growing out the front. And it's a system which is actually passive, so it doesn't need water inputs apart from just runoff from a roof. And those plants are self-seeding. Now that they've been growing for a while, they're self-seeding in those holes provided, and there are things living in there. So that's the kind of system that makes more sense. It's more like a natural cliff face, really. This is sort of the gold standard for reducing the impact of impervious surfaces. It's quite beautiful too, I think. And when I went there, it's in Queenscliff, I had a sneaky look on top of that roof and actually found that there are swamp rats living up there. That photo in the bottom left is a swamp rat burrow with the little husk of a Romulea corm. And that shows they've been feeding there. So most likely swamp rats. And also found that abandoned teal egg up there. So that is, to me, quite amazing to have things like that living on the roof. So from that, you could imagine kestrels or black-shouldered kites hovering above that roof and actually feeding from it. But of course, it's not a very low-hanging fruit to do that, although it does bring great benefits. It's very expensive and difficult to do in retrospect. And remember, in any case, from the perspective of wildlife, buildings might as well be boulders. So, what's the real limiting factor? The really important one anyway, that makes urban environments such a barrier to indigenous biodiversity? Well, this is my belief that it's what we do in between the boulders that has the big impact. And this is quite classic. It's an environment very green and lush, and it's designed that way to trick us into thinking that we are in a healthy environment, and because that's what makes us happy. But why fool ourselves when we can do it for real? Because this kind of environment, this is the way that wildlife experiences it on the whole. A dead landscape, dead-end food webs with introduced plants that don't fit into the local ecology. Yeah, of course there are things that do find resources there, but they're in the minority. Some people call them these novel ecosystems. They are also very, very heavily impoverished ecosystems. That's another classic, especially around where I live. Trees lining the streets that really don't have any biodiversity value at all. These are plain trees, and God, it would be good to find an indigenous alternative that we could swap out plain trees for, but it's big shoes to fill, you know. They do all sorts of special functions, like they look dead for half the year, they give everyone asthma the other half of the year, they block drains, all sorts of things which for the most part we just cannot find an indigenous plant that's able to do all of those functions. So we'll just keep planting plain trees then, I guess. And I'll just point out kikuyu is another really common one, and a grass which I think is particularly inhospitable for indigenous biodiversity. And there's just one example, is the common brown butterfly. I've seen them laying eggs on kikuyu, and then the caterpillars never survive. So that's an ecological trap right there. What about natives? What about all of the natives that people have been planting in their gardens, and councils have been planting as street trees around Melbourne for decades now, with the very noble view of restoring wildlife habitat? Well, unfortunately, that hasn't seen the benefits it should have, and that's for two important reasons, and here they are. We've mostly based native status on national boundaries rather than ecological boundaries, and perceived habitat value has been based largely on nectar production, which is a very shallow way of seeing the ecological roles of plants in all their complexity. So oftentimes that's been more harm than good. This golden whistler will lead us in a better direction, I hope. And here it is. It's landed in a tree in the Rippinley estate, which is an almost entirely exotic garden. No food in the golden elm there. No food in the willow myrtle, which is from WA. It lands in literally the only indigenous tree in Rippinley estate. I believe it's a self-seeded black wattle, and it finds a meal. Now, why is that? Well, most of the world's insects are plant eaters, and of those, about 90% are what are called host plant specialists, which means they only eat very, very few plant groups, and almost always it's those which they evolved alongside over long, long periods of time. So that means if you have landscapes not dominated by indigenous plants, you're going to have many fewer insects. And E.O. Wilson, the great ecologist and entomologist, was not understating it when he said insects are the little things which run the world. They really are the basis of terrestrial ecosystems and food webs. They pollinate 90% of the flowering plants, but they're also food directly or indirectly for almost everything. And as you can see, the caterpillar and these weevils, which I photographed in Elwood, very closely resemble those she oak cladodes, and that is a clue that they likely feed on nothing else at all. And here's a sample from a she oak in Elwood, all the things living on it. Fantastic diversity, but only the tip of the iceberg, really. And this puts things into perspective. North America has lost 3 billion birds from its skies in the last 50 years. It's a pretty unfathomable number. The really interesting thing is when you tease apart that data and look at the birds which rely on insects and those which don't, it's almost always the birds which rely on insects which have been the ones to decline. And the others have actually increased a little in general. So that tells us that our landscapes are hemorrhaging insects in a serious scale. And this goes some way to explaining why that might be. Of course, there are contributing factors, but I believe this is a major one in the urban landscape. And that is that we've replaced indigenous vegetation over broad areas with introduced vegetation. This research found that caterpillar biomass was reduced by 96% in hedgerows comprised of introduced plants. And now for anything that lives off of caterpillars or lives off of those things, etc., a 96% reduction in food is basically an unmanageable situation. That is, once again, a dead landscape. And globally, across 16 studies, insects have declined by 45% since 1970. This is something that we can really concentrate our efforts on with our plantings. And it might seem bleak, but that issue really does show us that the solutions are in our hands. And that figure on the left there is generally how we've done landscaping for a long, long time now, purely on aesthetic values. And while we can keep doing that, I'm arguing that we should also think about all of the important functions that our plants perform in our ecosystem, and factor that into our choices. And that will result in a lot more indigenous vegetation being used, inevitably. Here's the power of just one tree as an example. This is my neighbour's front yard, black wattle, and it was self-seeded. It is a beacon for wildlife, even though it is the only black wattle in this entire map area shown here. It's a very, very tiny part of the landscape, but supporting an enormous part of its biodiversity. So it has its own population of Clara satin moths, which live on it. It is also the hub in a foraging network of our local brown thornbills, probably often eating the caterpillars of those Clara satin moths. And in the late winter, early spring, when it flowers, there are swallows, welcome swallows, quartering back and forth for hours, picking off all of those little insects that are presumably pollinating it. And one of the most amazing things I thought was soon after the mega fires of 2020, 2021, we had flocks of yellow-tailed black cockatoos descending on this tree and chewing the grubs out for food. Now, they had been burnt out of their original landscape, and this tree was a lifeline for them for a little over a week, but of course one tree can only sustain so much. So we need to plant a lot more of them. And the reason I'm focusing on black wattles here is because I think with the reduced land that we have to work with, we ought to be focusing on, at least in the short term, on those plant species which are going to be able to really pump out biodiversity back into the wider world, and support a lot. You might call them keystone species or foundational species. If we could start replacing our introduced street trees with things like this, then suddenly the landscape would likely just spring to life. And there are just some of the reasons why black wattles are an example of one of these foundational plants. 2,000 invertebrate species found on them in the Melbourne area, up to 700 on a single tree. They support more mistletoe species than any other local tree, etc. And that's why I'm growing them en masse in my garden to give away to locals. Because if people can plant these in their own gardens or on their nature strips, then we're seriously changing the composition of the urban forest, if we want to call it that. Make it a real forest, bring the wildlife back. And I don't really think we've got time to wait for the mistakes of the past to continue doing their damage for another 100 or so years. So we should really be thinking about replacing these things ASAP. Because, we do get caught up thinking about nature out there being under threat. And indeed, that should concern us, and we should do everything we can to prevent the destruction of existing natural areas. But given that too much of it has been destroyed already, we all have to try to be part conservationist and part restorationist, which means being just as passionate about seizing opportunities to restore nature as we are about preventing its destruction. And I hope that this talk has shown that oftentimes that means thinking about nature when we're making even really small, mundane decisions like what we decide to plant in our gardens, or indeed if we're in the position of a public land manager, what goes into our parks and nature strips and streets, and even things like the colour of outdoor lighting, or how much land we're going to pave over. Little things like this all add up, and we understand that our negative impacts on the environment are cumulative. It's death by 1,000 cuts. So what it needs is saviour by 1,000 stitches.